The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the forward trench into a narrow river of brown filth. The men of Charlie Company huddled beneath soaked tarps and torn ponchos, rifles resting across their knees. They were exhausted, cold, and quietly praying for the next supply run to bring something warm, or at least dry socks. Private First Class Raymond Ray Cooper sat in the corner of a dugout, his hands busy with a strange collection of metal tubes, lenses, and wires. The others watched him with amused curiosity. The war had turned everyone into a scavenger, but Ray's tinkering had gone well beyond survival. "What the hell are you building now, Coop?" one of them shouted over the wind. Ray didn't look up. "Just trying to fix something the Army didn't think we needed." That drew laughter. Sergeant Miller, a battle-hardened veteran with a permanent smirk, spat into the mud and shook his head. "You gonna win the war with that junkyard telescope?" Ray smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll just see the war a little better than you." He had been a machinist back in Ohio before the draft. While others spent their downtime playing cards or writing letters, Ray scavenged broken binoculars, a cracked rifle scope, and the shattered lens from a downed reconnaissance camera. Over nights of trial and error, he pieced together what he called a poor man's sniper sight. But to the men around him, it was just another of Cooper's crazy projects. When dawn broke, the gray horizon revealed no movement except the smoke drifting over the hills. The silence made every drip of rain sound louder. Then, without warning, a German shell whistled overhead and exploded behind the trench, throwing dirt and shrapnel in every direction. The men ducked. Ray's makeshift scope clattered into the mud. "Guess your contraption's waterproof, huh?" Miller yelled, half laughing, half coughing through the smoke. "Guess we'll find out," Ray replied calmly, wiping mud from the lens with his sleeve. By mid-morning, the laughter had returned. The uneasy humor that soldiers used to keep the fear away. They teased Ray relentlessly, calling him Professor, Inventor, and Coop the Clockmaker. He took it all with a grin, but behind the smile, he was testing the clarity of his sightline again and again, adjusting the alignment by fractions of an inch. Through the broken horizon, he could see faint movement. Not men, not yet, but shadows where the enemy armor sometimes appeared before an assault. The others couldn't see that far, and no one cared. They'd fought this stretch of no man's land for weeks. Nothing ever changed. That evening, as the sun tried to push through the clouds, Ray finally mounted his homemade scope onto his M1917 rifle. It wasn't pretty. Held together by brass fittings, a bent bracket, and sheer determination. But when he peered through it, the world sharpened into focus in a way he'd never seen before. He could see the German line over a mile away, the glint of helmets, the faint outline of a half-buried Panzer turret. His pulse quickened. Behind him, someone chuckled. "Hey, Professor, tell us what the Krauts had for breakfast." More laughter. Ray ignored them. His hands were steady, his breath slow. He wasn't thinking about jokes anymore. He was thinking about distance, wind, and steel. Miller leaned over the trench wall and looked at him with a crooked smile. "You're wasting your time, Co-op. You can't hit a tank with that thing, even if you could see it." Ray turned slightly, eyes still on the horizon. "We'll see about that." The laughter echoed again, but softer this time, less certain. The sound of rain mixed with distant thunder, and for a moment, even the skeptics fell silent. Somewhere out there, the next battle was waiting, and no one yet knew that the quiet machinist from Ohio was about to change everything with his so-called junkyard telescope. The next morning broke under a pale, washed-out sun. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy silence over the trenches. Steam rose from the mud as the men began their usual routine, checking rifles, patching gear, and pretending not to think about what the next bombardment might bring. Ray Cooper sat apart from the rest, crouched over a small wooden crate that served as his workshop. His hands worked with the precision of a jeweler, every motion careful, deliberate. The other soldiers had seen him do this before, always tinkering, always adjusting, but this time was different. His homemade scope wasn't just a toy anymore. It was becoming something real. In front of him lay his tools: a bent screwdriver, a broken compass needle, a strip of copper wire peeled from a radio, and 2 lenses scavenged from a shattered pair of field binoculars. To most men, it was junk. To Ray, it was possibility. He tightened a small bracket he'd filed from a discarded belt buckle, aligning the lenses through a length of pipe cut from an artillery shell casing. He whispered numbers under his breath: magnification ratios, focal lengths, the quiet language of someone who saw precision in chaos. Sergeant Miller leaned over the edge of the trench, watching. "You really think that hunk of trash is gonna see farther than army glass?" Ray didn't look up. "Army glass fogs up. This one won't." "Why?" "Because I built it to work in mud, not in an officer's parade." The sergeant smirked but said nothing. Deep down, even he admired the stubbornness. Ray's obsession had begun months earlier, after seeing a sniper miss a German machine gun crew because his scope fogged in the morning mist. 3 men died that day. To Ray, that failure wasn't fate, it was a flaw to be fixed. And fixing things was what he did best. As the day warmed, he calibrated the alignment by sighting distant tree lines and fence posts beyond no man's land. Each tiny turn of the screw brought clarity, each adjustment shaving off distortion. The other men watched now, quieter, as if sensing something was changing. Private Jenkins, the youngest of them, crouched beside him. "You really made that from scrap?" Ray nodded. "Scrap and patience. Where'd you learn that stuff?" "My old man built cameras back home. I built everything else." For a moment, Jenkins just stared. Then, as if embarrassed, he muttered, "Guess it's better than playing cards." By noon, the trench filled with the familiar growl of approaching engines, distant but distinct. The sound rolled over the hills like thunder. Everyone froze. "Panzers! Positions!" Miller barked. The laughter, the teasing, all gone in an instant. Ray slid his scope onto the rifle's mounting rail. The fit wasn't perfect, but it held. He pressed his eye to the lens. The world snapped into focus, crystal clear, magnified, alive. Through the glass, he saw what others couldn't. 3 dark shapes cresting the ridge nearly a mile away, sunlight flashing off their armor. "They're coming," Ray said softly. No one else could see them yet, but his calm certainty sent a shiver through the squad. Miller crouched beside him, squinting through standard field glasses. "I'll be damned. How far are they?" "About 1,200 yards. "That's impossible." Ray smiled faintly. "Not with the right sight." He adjusted the elevation knob, a part salvaged from a broken watch, and steadied his breathing. The trench fell silent again, every man listening to the slow mechanical clicks of his handmade scope locking into place. In that quiet, they realized something. This wasn't madness. It was genius disguised as obsession. Ray wasn't just tinkering anymore. He was preparing, methodically, purposefully, for a shot no one believed could be made. When he finally looked up, the sky had dimmed to gray again. The Panzers were closing in, and every man around him now saw the same thing in his eyes that he'd seen all along: focus, calm, and the faintest spark of defiance. The improvised genius was ready. The air felt heavier that afternoon, thick with the smell of oil and wet earth. The men in Charlie Company could sense it before they heard it. That deep, distant vibration that made the ground itself tremble. First, it sounded like thunder. But thunder doesn't come in rhythm. Ray Cooper looked up from his rifle, listening. The faint rumble grew louder, rolling through the low hills ahead of them. Someone muttered, "Tanks." Another soldier cursed under his breath. Within seconds, the entire trench came alive with movement. Helmets on, rifles checked, machine guns rotated toward the ridge. Ray adjusted the scope on his rifle, his hands steady even as the noise built into a mechanical roar. Through his lens, he saw the horizon shimmer with heat and dust. Then, out of that haze, the shapes appeared, gray, angular beasts, their armor glinting like mirrors under the pale sun. Panzers. The first one crawled forward, its treads grinding through the mud, followed by two more. They moved slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of something nearly unstoppable. Behind them, infantry followed, small dark figures advancing in disciplined waves. Miller ducked into the trench beside Ray. 3 of them, maybe more behind the ridge. Looks like MarkIVs. Ray nodded, eyes still on the scope. That's what I thought. Air support? Miller asked. Ray shook his head. We're on our own. The men began shouting coordinates to the artillery crews behind them. Moments later, the sky cracked open with the sound of outgoing shells. Explosions lit the hillside, kicking up fountains of dirt and smoke. But the Panzers kept coming. Their armor absorbed the near misses like rain. Ray tracked one of the tanks through his scope, noting the way the light caught the bolts along its turret. He could see the machine gun port, the slits in the commander's cupola. The clarity stunned him. His homemade scope was holding perfectly. "Jesus, Coop," Jenkins whispered beside him. "You can actually see them?" "Every rivet," Ray murmured. The Panzers opened fire. The first shell hit short, sending a shockwave through the trench and spraying mud over the men. The second slammed into the ridge behind them, collapsing part of the wall. They ducked, ears ringing. Ray's mind wasn't on the explosions. He was measuring wind direction, elevation, distance. He'd done this math in his head 1,000 times before, but never with lives on the line like this. He spoke quietly to Miller. "If they reach the wire, we're done. The .30s won't touch that armor." "Then what do you suggest, Professor?" Miller snapped. Ray exhaled. "I suggest I try something stupid." Before Miller could stop him, Ray hoisted his rifle onto the trench edge, resting the barrel across a sandbag. The others stared in disbelief. Against 3 tanks? With a standard-issue rifle? It was suicide. But Ray's expression didn't change. Through his scope, he could see the lead Panzer's commander standing half-exposed from the hatch, shouting orders through a loudhailer. The distance, 1,200 yards. The wind light, left to right. The shot nearly impossible. He steadied his breathing. In his mind, everything else fell away. The explosions, the shouting, the pounding of his own heart. All that remained was the thin crosshair hovering over a single human silhouette framed in steel. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. For a moment, nothing. Then, through the scope, he saw the commander jerk backward, disappearing into the hatch. The tank slowed. Confusion rippled through the formation. The following Panzers hesitated, their formation breaking for the first time. "Holy hell," Jenkins whispered. He hit him, but Ray didn't move. He was already reloading, adjusting the scope again. "Range confirmed," he muttered. "Let's see if lightning strikes twice." Another shot. This one struck near the optics on the turret. Sparks flew. The tank's forward gun wavered and went silent. The men in the trench began shouting. Not in fear this time, but disbelief and adrenaline. Miller stared at Ray like he was seeing him for the first time. "You're out of your damn mind," he said, half laughing. Ray finally looked away from the scope, his face calm, voice steady. "Sometimes, Sergeant, that's what it takes to see straight." The Panzers halted, Their advance stalled under one man's fire. Smoke drifted across the field, turning the sunlight into a dull orange glow. The sound of engines faded, replaced by a fragile quiet that hung over the battlefield like an unfinished sentence. For now, at least, the line had held. And somewhere deep in that silence, every man in Charlie Company began to believe. Maybe the crazy machinist from Ohio wasn't crazy after all. Smoke rolled across the field like a heavy curtain, swallowing the horizon. The echoes of tank fire faded into the distance, replaced by the slow dripping of rain against helmets and broken wood. For a long moment, no one in Charlie Company spoke. They simply stared across no man's land, stunned by what had just happened. Ray Cooper lowered his rifle, his shoulder aching from the recoil. His homemade scope was splattered with mud, but the glass held. Through it, he could still see the hulking silhouette of the lead Panzer, stopped cold, its turret frozen in place. The hatch remained open, motionless. Around him, disbelief turned to murmurs. Did he really hit that? From this distance? Hell, I didn't even see the guy he was aiming at. Sergeant Miller stood up from the trench wall, brushing mud off his uniform. For once, the sarcasm was gone from his voice. You just dropped a Panzer commander at 1,200 yards with a standard rifle. I don't know whether to court-martial you or salute you. Ray didn't answer. His eyes were still on the ridge, scanning for movement. He wasn't celebrating, not yet. He'd learned long ago that silence on the battlefield didn't always mean safety. Then, from somewhere behind the ridge, came the faint grinding of gears. Another engine. Another tank. Contact! Someone yelled. Another one's moving. The men ducked low again, rifles at the ready. Ray adjusted his scope, wiping the lens with the edge of his sleeve. The next Panzer appeared from the smoke, moving cautiously this time, its guns sweeping side to side. They had learned something from the first shot, but so had Ray. He exhaled slowly, remembering what his father had taught him years ago in the machine shop back in Ohio. Measure twice, cut once. He made a small correction for wind and distance. Through the lens, he could see the faint shimmer of heat waves around the tank's barrel. The world narrowed to that single image. His heartbeat slowed. The rest of the trench faded away. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Through the scope, he saw a spark, a glint off the gun mount, and then the tank shuddered to a stop. Its turret sagged, the barrel dipping like a wounded animal bowing its head. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then a low whistle came from Jenkins. That's two, he whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. The men began to look at Ray differently. The teasing, the jokes, the laughter, it all vanished. What replaced it was something heavier, almost reverent. Even Miller, who'd spent months calling him Professor, now spoke quietly. Coop, how in God's name did you do that? Ray gave a faint, tired smile. Just fixed what was broken. Above them, the clouds began to break apart, revealing streaks of pale sunlight cutting through the haze. The battlefield, moments ago alive with fire and chaos, was now eerily still. Even the birds had gone silent. Ray set his rifle down and rubbed his shoulder. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the release of tension. Every nerve in his body hummed with the strange calm that follows survival. Then came the realization they had survived because of him. One man, one rifle, one handmade scope. Word spread fast along the trench. Men who had mocked him hours earlier now crowded around to see the rifle. The odd-looking sight bolted to it. They touched it like a relic, whispering to each other as if afraid to break it by looking too closely. Ray didn't boast. He didn't explain. He just cleaned the mud from the lens, checked the mount, and set the rifle back beside him. To him, it wasn't magic, it was mechanics. precision, belief that something could work if you built it right. As evening fell, the last rays of sun lit the smoke drifting above the field. The once loud trench grew quiet. The jokes were gone. So was the doubt. Miller finally broke the silence. "Guess we owe you a drink, Professor." Ray chuckled softly, eyes still on the horizon. "Make it after the next fight. I've got more work to do." No one laughed this time. They just nodded, because now, when Cooper spoke, the whole trench listened. And as night settled over the battered landscape, the men who once mocked him found themselves waiting for his next move, trusting, perhaps for the first time, that the quiet machinist with the junkyard scope might just be the reason they were still alive. Dawn crept over the battlefield in thin streaks of gray light, cutting through the fog that clung to the valley floor. The night had been long and tense. Every man in Charlie Company waited for the next German push, but it never came. Only the occasional echo of distant engines reminded them that the enemy was still out there, waiting too. Ray Cooper sat awake, his rifle resting across his knees, his homemade scope cleaned and ready. The lens caught the morning light and reflected a small, perfect circle onto the trench wall. He hadn't slept at all. He couldn't. Not after what he'd seen through that glass. Not after what he'd done with it. Sergeant Miller climbed down beside him, a tin mug of coffee in hand. "You even blink last night, Coop?" Ray shook his head. "Not much to dream about." Miller sipped his drink and looked toward the ridge. "Scouts say they're regrouping. We might see armor again before noon." The words hung heavy in the damp air. When the sound came, low, distant, unmistakable, it was like a promise being kept. Engines. Heavy ones. The ground trembled as 3 Panzers rolled into view once more, flanked by infantry moving with mechanical precision. This time, they didn't advance blindly. They came in staggered formation, turrets scanning, guns ready. The Germans had learned, but so had Ray. He climbed onto the trench edge, lying flat against the dirt. The cold mud pressed into his cheek as he adjusted the scope. His breathing slowed. The world around him seemed to fade again. The shouting, the artillery, even the whine of incoming shells. Only the scope mattered now. Through the lens, he found the lead tank. The number painted on its side, 214, was clear as day. The commander was exposed, shouting orders to the infantry ahead. The distance was over 1,200 yards, maybe a little more. Even trained snipers would call it impossible with standard equipment. But Ray wasn't thinking about records or glory. He was thinking about the men behind him, the ones who'd stopped laughing. He adjusted the elevation knob, just 2 clicks. Wind direction. Steady from the west. Temperature. Cold enough to slow the powder burn slightly. He compensated. Every detail mattered. "Coop," Miller said quietly from behind him. "If you miss," Ray cut him off softly. "Then I'll reload." He exhaled. The trigger broke cleanly under his finger. The crack echoed down the valley, swallowed by the distant roar of engines. Through the scope, he tracked the vapor trail, a whisper of death cutting through the air. Then impact. The Panzer's commander snapped backward as if pulled by an invisible string. His helmet flew off, spinning through the air before vanishing into the smoke. The tank lurched, gears grinding, the machine gun falling silent. Ray's hands didn't move. He kept watching, waiting for confirmation. Then it came. The turret stopped turning, the crew inside frozen in confusion. One of the infantrymen waved frantically for support, but the second tank hesitated, unsure of what had just happened. In the trench, the men burst into cheers. Some shouted, some just stared, mouths open in disbelief. Jenkins nearly fell backward, yelling, "He did it! He actually did it!" But Ray said nothing. He ejected the shell casing, its brass still warm, and slid another round into the chamber. "Not done yet," he whispered. He shifted aim to the second Panzer, tracking its movement. The driver, perhaps panicked by the first tank's destruction, had turned slightly to the side, exposing a vulnerable joint where the armor plates overlapped. It was a shot no sane man would take. Too small, too uncertain, but Ray wasn't guessing. He fired again. A sharp clang, then a sudden plume of smoke. The Panzer shuddered, one tread snapping like a broken chain. It ground to a halt, crippled. For a moment, even the Germans seemed frozen. Then, slowly, the remaining troops began to retreat, dragging wounded men behind them. The last functioning tank reversed, disappearing into the fog. Silence followed, deep, almost sacred. Miller crouched beside him, eyes wide. That was impossible. Ray lowered the rifle, finally letting his breath out. "No," he said softly. "Just math and luck." The men laughed, but this time it wasn't mockery. It was awe, a release of fear and disbelief. The trench that once echoed with jokes about his junkyard telescope now buzzed with something else entirely: respect. Ray wiped the lens of his scope one more time and looked toward the empty ridge. The battlefield was quiet again, but this time the silence belonged to them. Behind him, Miller spoke quietly. "They'll be telling that story for years, Co-op." Ray gave a faint, weary smile. "Then let's make sure we live long enough to hear it." And as the morning fog lifted, the men of Charlie Company realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A miracle born not of faith, but of one man's stubborn belief that precision and courage could still change the course of war. The battle for the ridge was over. Smoke drifted lazily across the valley, mixing with the faint smell of diesel and burnt steel. The Panzer wrecks still smoldered in the distance, twisted and broken, silent monuments to what had happened that morning. The men of Charlie Company walked among them in disbelief, each footstep crunching through the frozen mud like echoes of a dream they couldn't quite believe was real. Ray Cooper sat apart from the others, cleaning his rifle as if it were an ordinary day. The scope, the homemade contraption everyone had once laughed at, lay beside him on a folded rag, glass glinting faintly in the weak afternoon sun. Every few seconds, a soldier would glance over, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. Sergeant Miller approached, his helmet tucked under one arm. "You realize they're already talking about you," he said. Ray didn't look up. "They talk about everything. Give it a day, they'll move on." Miller crouched beside him, lowering his voice. "Not this time. Word's already spreading to Battalion HQ. They're calling it the 1,200-yard shot. Some even say Command wants to see your scope." Ray paused, running his thumb along the rifle's stock. "Funny, isn't it? A week ago they called it junk." Miller chuckled. "A week ago, we didn't think it could drop a Panzer from 3/4 of a mile. By evening, the campfire buzzed with stories, exaggerated, retold, reshaped by adrenaline and awe. 'He hit the commander right between the eyes,' someone said. 'Through fog,' shouted another. 'Didn't even need a second shot.' Laughter and disbelief blended into admiration. For the first time, no one called him Tinker Ray or the junkyard sniper. He was just Cooper now, the man who had done the impossible. The next morning, 2 officers arrived in a muddy jeep. They inspected the damaged tanks and interviewed the men. When they reached Ray, he stood at attention, his rifle slung neatly across his back. "Private Cooper," one of them said, adjusting his cap. "We've reviewed reports from your unit. That was exceptional marksmanship. Where'd you get the scope?" Ray hesitated. "Made it myself, sir. Out of a broken field glass and some spare mounts from a wrecked rifle." The officer blinked. "You built it?" With your own hands. Yes, sir. Just needed something with a little more reach. The two officers exchanged looks, then smiled faintly. Half disbelief, half respect. You might want to write down how you did it, Cooper. The boys in the armory could use some of that ingenuity. When they left, the men crowded around him again. Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. See, Coop? You're famous now. Ray laughed softly. Fame doesn't stop bullets, Jenkins. But deep down, he felt something shift. For months, he'd been the odd one out, the quiet mechanic who tinkered when others rested. Now, those same hands that once built toys and tools had created something that saved lives. As the days passed, rumors of his shot spread beyond the company, through regiment, then division. Letters came in from other units asking about the sniper with the homemade scope. A newspaper correspondent even showed up weeks later, wanting to write a feature. Ray declined the interview. Tell the story if you want, he said quietly. But make sure you mention the men who held that line. A scope doesn't mean much without someone to guard your back. That humility only deepened the legend. To the soldiers, he wasn't just a sharpshooter, he was one of them. A man who turned scrap metal and glass into a weapon of hope. Months later, during a brief leave in France, Ray walked into an armory tent. On a table lay a prototype rifle fitted with a newly designed long-range scope. The label read, "Experimental, based on field modifications observed in combat, 1944. He ran his hand over it, recognizing the same principles, the same adjustments he'd once made by hand under fire. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Miller appeared behind him. Looks familiar, huh? Ray nodded. Guess they finally decided homemade ain't so bad after all. Miller grinned. You're part of the story now. Co-op part of how the next war will be fought. Ray looked out through the tent flap at the gray sky over the French countryside. Let's just hope there isn't a next one. The wind carried the faint echo of laughter and gunfire from a training range nearby. It felt distant, like the memory of another life. From mockery to legend, from laughter to silence, the story of one stubborn soldier and his improvised scope had become something greater. A reminder that ingenuity and courage, no matter how small, could turn the tide of history. Night had settled like a blanket over the ruined countryside. The stars were dim behind drifting clouds, and the only sound was the faint crackle of a dying fire. Ray Cooper sat alone on a wooden crate near the edge of camp, his rifle across his lap, the scope lens reflecting the soft amber glow of the flames. It had been weeks since the 1,200-yard shot, weeks since laughter had turned into respect. Yet inside he felt no triumph. The battlefield had a way of twisting victories into something quieter, heavier. He looked down at his hands, steady, scarred, and still stained from oil and gunpowder. Those hands had built machines, repaired engines, and now taken lives. He wasn't haunted by faces, not exactly, but by moments. The stillness before each shot, the calm precision that came over him when everything else fell away. Miller approached, boots crunching softly in the dirt. You're at it again, he said. Ray didn't look up. Habit. You ever stop to think about it? What goes through your head before you pull that trigger? Ray thought for a long moment before answering. Everything and nothing. Miller sat beside him, silent. Ray continued, his voice low, almost detached. When I look through that scope, it's not about hate. It's not even about killing. It's about solving a problem: wind, distance, movement. My mind turns it all into numbers, angles, seconds. The man on the other end, he's just part of the equation. I don't see a face until after. He paused, his thumb tracing the edge of the trigger guard. That's the strange thing, Miller. Feels peaceful just for a second. The noise fades, the chaos disappears. It's just me and the shot. Miller nodded slowly. And afterward? Ray's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Afterward, it all comes back. The sound, the smell, the faces. You remind yourself they were aiming back, that it was them or you. But sometimes, he trailed off, shaking his head. Sometimes, I wonder what they were thinking about a second before I pulled the trigger. Maybe they had a family photo in their pocket, too. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of artillery far in the distance. The war was still out there, endless, grinding, impersonal. Ray lifted the rifle, peering through his handmade scope once more, scanning the treeline beyond camp even though there was no threat. To anyone watching, it looked like paranoia. But to him, it was instinct. A marksman's mind never truly rests. Every shadow could be movement. Every flicker of light could be danger. Inside that scope, he found clarity. Not peace, never peace, but control. He'd read once, before the war, that great shooters weren't born with steady hands. They trained their minds to slow time, to live between heartbeats. That's what it felt like now, living in the space between one breath and the next. Behind him, Miller said quietly, "You know, I think that's what separates you, co-op. You don't pull the trigger out of fear or anger. You do it because someone has to and you can." Ray smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe I just got good at pretending it doesn't get to me. He remembered his first real shot months ago. Not the Panzer, not even the German officer, but a sniper duel in Normandy. 2 men, 2 scopes, 1 heartbeat. He had seen the flash of the other rifle first, known he had half a second to react. The bullet missed his ear by inches. His return shot found its mark. He never forgot how still the world felt afterward. That memory had never left him. Not because of what he did, but because of what he understood then. The man he shot was him on the other side. Calm, precise, focused, doing his job just the same. Now, as he looked through the lens again, Ray saw not enemies, but mirrors. Reflections of men fighting the same fight under a different flag. He sighed, lowering the rifle. "You know, Miller, I think being a marksman isn't about killing. It's about seeing. You see farther, clearer, sometimes too much." Miller looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Maybe that's why your shot mattered. Not just because you hit it, but because you never forgot what it cost." Ray gave a quiet nod. The night deepened. A faint glow appeared in the east, the promise of another dawn, another mission. He slid the scope cover into place and leaned the rifle against the crate. Tomorrow they'd move again. More fields, more targets, more distance to close. But as the camp grew still, Ray felt a strange calm wash over him. Not pride, not joy, just understanding. Inside the mind of a marksman, the war was never about glory. It was about precision, survival, and the quiet hope that maybe, when it was all over, his hands could build something again. Something that healed instead of destroyed. He looked up at the stars, whispering softly to himself, "Someday, I'll use these hands for peace." The fire flickered low, and the marksman closed his eyes, drifting into uneasy sleep. His mind still tracing invisible trajectories across the dark, endless sky.